Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. Who is the greatest sports team of all time? Try asking that question to a room full of sports fans and you'll witness an intense and passionate debate. It's the question that Wall Street Journal deputy editor Sam Walker set out to answer in his new book, The Captain Class. But in his extensive research for the book, Sam became obsessed with another question. What did these elite teams have in common? His answer surprised everyone, including himself. Each team had the same type of captain, a single leader who drove the team's historic success. But the men and women who make up the captain class weren't who you'd expect. On today's episode, Sam shares his surprising research and breaks down the 7 core qualities of the captain class. His fresh, counterintuitive take on leadership will challenge your assumptions of what real leadership looks like. Are you ready? Here's my conversation with Sam Walker. So, Sam, it's such a pleasure to have you on. Tell me this first. What sparked the idea for this book, The Captain Class?
Yeah, it started with a really simple question, which is, what makes great teams great? I'd worked for the Wall Street Journal for a long time as a sports columnist, and I had this sort of terrific and, ridiculous job, which is I just kind of traveled all over the world to major events to cover all the big stories. And so, I had occasion to meet so many elite teams. I mean, they were all playing for championships. They were all at the top of their game. And, I thought I had a pretty good handle on what they were like. They all had similarities, and I developed sort of a profile in my head. But, as I went on, I started to realize that most of these teams just, they never managed to succeed, to repeat their success, I should say. They would, rise for a while and fall. And I started to wonder, what it was that actually helped teams endure. What was it about a culture or the composition that helped the team succeed again and again over time? And I started to think, I'd taken in so many different points of input. I thought, I could have given you a dozen reasons why I thought any team was one of the best that I'd seen, but I didn't believe that they could all possibly matter equally. So I started to wonder, what if there were 3 things that every team had, or 4 things, or even 1 thing that was the foundational piece, the foundational piece of DNA that allowed everything else to fall into place? I didn't believe that all those factors could be equally weighted. So I decided I was going to study this. I said, all right, I'm going to bang this out. I'm going to do a 900-word column for the Wall Street Journal. Here are the 10 best teams of all time, and here's what they had in common, right? So I started that process so naively, and I just realized that it was quickly found it to be the biggest rabbit hole I've ever been down.
I bet.
And that was 12 years ago. So, and now it's a book, not a column.
Right.
So
it's a little more. It's a little more than 900 words now, right?
A little bit. I'm just a shade over. So.
Yeah, well, but The Captain Class, I've read it, of course, and loved it. I loved it. What was the methodology you used to choose sort of the world's greatest teams?
Well, I realized that if I was going to do this, first of all, no one had ever done this before. I mean, I searched around and found a lot of lists, and they were either limited to, one country or one sport. I'd never seen anyone who tried to do a kind of rigorous, comprehensive, and objective study that was based on a methodology and based on numbers and not just opinion. So I realized I had to start big, and I took the biggest possible canvas I could, which is I looked at every single winning team in the history of sports in 37 different categories of sports since the 1880s. And it was over 10,000 teams when I finally got the list put together. And, from there, I realized I actually had to narrow it down a bit. So I came up with a couple of criteria. I mean, the first thing I realized is, what's a team? How do you define a team? And I decided that a real team in the truest sense would not only, the players would not only compete with one another, but they would also engage directly with the opponent. So something like a boxing team or a rowing team wouldn't qualify. I also decided they had to have at least 5 members because, otherwise we're talking about something else. We're talking about a partnership or a smaller group where individual performance matters more than collective performance. So after I did that, it narrowed it down a bit. But really, the next question was the big one, which is how do you define excellence? There's so many ways to look at it. So, I decided, all right, this team must have played at the highest level of competition in the world against the best possible competition and played a lot, played frequently. So that eliminated a lot of teams. But really the last thing, the one that really, I had 122 teams that I thought were elite at the end of the day. And, the thing that knocked it down to this final 16 was just one thing, which is that if you're going to say you're the greatest team of all time or one of them, what you did, your accomplishments must be greater than those of any team in your sport. So the 16 teams in the final list, their accomplishments were completely unique, either in the number of championships they won over time or the percentage of games that they won. So that narrowed it down. And, this was a brutal bar.
Oh, my
gosh. It was really hard.
I'm already exhausted.
But I had to cut so many great teams. I cut the current New England Patriots. I've got a lot of grief about.
Wow.
But, their record wasn't that much better than the San Francisco 49ers of the 80s and 90s. It was identical, really. So I didn't feel they were unique. And the Chicago Bulls, Michael Jordan's Bulls had the same problems. It's, they didn't win more championships or win more games over a long period of time than the Boston Celtics or the San Antonio Spurs dynasties. So they went too, and people are throwing tomatoes at me, in those days for that. But I had to set a really high bar. But listen, the point wasn't to end this argument forever. It's my favorite argument. I'm happy to have it with anyone in any country in the world at this point. But the point wasn't to settle this debate once and for all. It wasn't to say, these are absolutely the best teams of all time, and we could have that debate all day long. And I love that debate. The point was really that I wanted to put together a scientific sample. I wanted a completely objective list of teams that were just absolutely, completely outstanding by every measure. And I would use them to answer the larger question, which is, what did they have in common? What is the DNA of a great team?
Mm-hmm. And what did you expect to find, and what did you actually find?
Well, that's when the surprises started, because first of all, some of the teams on that list I'd never heard of. I mean, the Cuban women's volleyball team from the 1990s, that's the greatest Olympic team of all time. I'd never heard of them. And, there were several teams like that. So that was the first surprise. The next surprise was, I figured, like a lot of people, okay, it's probably talent, right? It's either superstars or it's the overall talent of the team. And if not that, the thing I thought it would probably be was coaching, and that these teams just had outstanding coaches, all who were of a certain type. And if it wasn't that, I figured it would be brilliant tactics or money. And those are the things I went in, those are the prejudices I had going in. And one by one, as I studied those things, I realized that none of them even applied to a majority of these teams.
Wow.
Some of them had great talent, some had mediocre talent, some had great coaches, some had new coaches, lousy coaches. They changed coaches during their run. So there was absolutely no pattern there at all. And that led to the next surprise, which was there was only one thing they had in common. And you know what? It was obvious. It was slap your forehead simple. And I didn't even believe it when I first saw it. But if you looked at their dynasty, it corresponded precisely with the arrival and departure of one player. And that player was always the captain, or eventually become the captain. And this just repeated itself over and over with this eerie regularity. And, I went back and triple checked all the other things to make sure I wasn't missing anything. But, in the end, it was absolutely clear that was the only thing, the only trait that they all shared. And that, the foundational DNA of a great team was, the person who was chosen to lead the players.
Wow, that's incredible. And you identified like 7 traits of these individuals, right? So you narrowed it all down. I mean, I'm sort of totally following you on this process. And then you identified 7 traits of these individuals. Can you kind of walk our listeners through those 7?
Yeah, well, the traits, this was the biggest surprise of all, which is that, like a lot of people, I thought, I had these preconceived notions of leadership. Look, I didn't set out to write a leadership book, so I wasn't, the world's greatest expert back then on leadership, but I had these prejudices. I don't know where they came from, but I thought that a leader should be pretty obvious, right? A superstar, charismatic, like, a real, the person who kind of took the shot with the game on the line, and also thought they would be just, great examples of sportsmanship and great behavior, and that they, it wouldn't be that complicated. But what I found when I started looking at the men and women who were the captains of these teams, it was really surprising. They didn't conform to any of those ideas at all. In fact, most of those things were completely irrelevant. What they were was this weird subset. I mean, they were not superstars for the most part. They were mostly grunt. They did the grunt work. They were, they played in defensive positions, and they didn't get the glory at all. In fact, I didn't even know who some of them were. I knew the teams very well, but I didn't know who these captains were. And they liked that. They hated attention. They hated personal, individual accomplishments. They only cared about the team and its accomplishments. And they were not speech makers. They didn't give big speeches. They had a different kind of communication that was very practical and constant, but not flashy at all. And they were tough. They could be renegades. That really surprised me. I mean, they would push back against management whenever they thought something wasn't going right, and they introduced conflict into their teams in a lot of cases. And they often played right to the edge of the rules if they thought they could get away with it, and even broke them at times and did sort of unsportsmanlike things. And those traits, the traits that I noticed, so I finally just, got all these captains, and I took anecdotes from all of them and labeled them and used them like data points. And this took years to put together, but I finally found these 7 traits that were patterns across all of the captains. And, they were some of the things I wasn't that surprised by. They were relentless. I mean, relentless to an extreme. I mean, no matter what the score, they played absolutely as hard as they could. Also, they had this incredible ironclad emotional control. I mean, I saw instances where they played through incredible personal tragedies, and not only played well, but excelled in those situations. So they were very emotionally controlled. And, beyond that, it was that water carrying. I mean, they most of them were people who played in supporting positions and let the stars be the stars, and did everything they could to support the team. And I mentioned the communication piece, which I thought was fascinating. The way they communicated was it was not through speeches and grand gestures. It was this style of communication that is typified by Tim Duncan of the San Antonio Spurs.
Yeah, I read that.
If Duncan has seen interviews with him, I mean, he's not exciting.
Right.
He's not a charismatic guy.
Right.
But, he engages very intensely one-on-one with his teammates and talks to them, listens as much as he talks, and he corrects problems in the moment and helps to create kind of a talkative culture on that team. And so those are some of the qualities. I just, all of them, each one individually and really as a package were really kind of revolutionary to me. I'd never thought of leadership in that way. And it gave me a sense that, I think we've all kind of lost our way here. We've forgotten what great leaders really do and what they're really like. And that was sort of the beginning of this whole odyssey.
How eye-opening that was. I'm sure that was obviously incredibly exciting. And when you think about it, a lot of our listeners are business people, right? So how do you apply this if you're a leader, an emerging leader, and you're listening to this? How do you lift this up and apply it to your work?
Well, I think the first thing is that, we have to take a completely different approach when we're looking for a leader. And I'm talking about a leader of a unit or the head of a business division. I mean, we're kind of, in a business context, I first think the CEO, the person at the top of the organization, I really think they're akin to the coach or the manager of a team. And what I've found in all these cases is that every great coach, the greatest coaches in sports history, always had, during their greatest runs, they had a captain just like this. And we're talking about Belichick and Tim Brady. We're talking about Gregg Popovich and Tim Duncan, Alex Ferguson and Roy Keane. I mean, they all came as kind of a twin set. And this is important. So what I would say first is that decision, that person you put in charge of the team below you, is far more important than you realize, and it's something that should probably take up a lot more of your time and thought. And when you're selecting that person, you have to completely change your mindset about what you're looking for. And, I've come up with some little bits of advice that I think would be helpful when you're looking.
Yeah, I'd love it.
Sure. Well, the first one is probably the craziest sounding one, but what I would advise is if you're looking for a leader on your team, walk in, when the team is sort of interacting sometime and look around the room and think, if I was coming here the first time and I knew nothing, who's the last person that I would ever think was the leader of this team? And start there. It might not be that person, but you're probably closer to the right answer than you would be if you came and said, who's the leader? Because they're not the loudest voice in the room. They're not obvious. They're not the star. It's not always the person who shines brightest. So, when you're evaluating people, you have to really watch how your team interacts, because that's when you start to see these people, because they're not the person who sets the tone or is always out front, leading the way. It's usually someone who is circulating, someone who talks to everyone, feels comfortable approaching everybody, who is, constantly interacting, listening, talking with great intensity to everyone in the room, quietly, sort of working around the perimeter. That's the personality you're looking for. Another test that I would give job candidates is, I call it the sneaky praise test. And that's that, when you're talking to them, look at their resume, find something they did and just start heaping praise on them, how smart they must have been, what a great job they did, how their leadership must have been so inspiring. And if they're not squirming in their chair and kind of embarrassed and trying to deflect credit and they'll lay a lot of the credit on their teammates, then you may have the wrong person, because most of these leaders were really never wanted to be singled out and would never blossom if you started giving that kind of attention. Another thing that I noticed was that these athletes in sports, the captains they can be incredibly aggressive and play very hard on the field, often to a point where they did things that were really not great, and they would sort of push the rules a little too far. But once they got off the field, they completely changed. It's like a switch went off, and they would be incredibly just completely normal, never got in trouble, never did anything aggressive. They completely conformed to the rules of society. They understood the rules of sports were different. I think the same thing is true in business. You have to find these people who give everything, and in some cases may actually go a little too far, in their zeal to help the team. But you need to understand when you're talking to people that boring is beautiful. A lot of times we think that, that someone's resume, we think, well, it's great. Oh, look, they're a triathlete and they're a gourmet chef, and they, have this incredible circle of friends, and they're really exciting off the field, and they do all these adventurous things. Well, most of the leaders that I found were just boring. I mean, they were just dull. I mean, they went home, they slept 8 to 12 hours in one case a night. I mean, they never did anything, and they kind of saved all of their energy for the effort. And they had, pretty stable and sort of happy but dull home lives. So that's something that, it might be worth looking for when you're interviewing candidates.
That's really interesting. Yes, keep going. This is great.
Yeah, well, there are a few more. One other thing is just, you need to sniff. These great leaders have this sort of emotional dexterity. I mean, some people call it emotional intelligence. I'm not sure that term. I think that term's gotten really broad, but I think the idea is that they were able to respond and to deal with people whatever their backgrounds were, and they were able to understand what motivated them and how to talk to them and how to help them. And I think that's the kind of thing that often comes from character, from having hard knocks in life. And I think if you find job candidates who have, had gone through tough situations in their lives and come out and push through them, I think you're probably, I think that's a big bonus in terms of finding that sort of emotional fluidity and dexterity that I was talking about. That's another way. And then, one thing that I think is two more things. The first thing is that I think a lot of times we look at things people have done in the past and we disqualify them from leadership because of things they've done. And, maybe this was pushing things a little too far at the office, or in sports, it could be breaking the rules in a kind of flagrant way. I mean, I always point to Tom Brady. who allegedly deflated the footballs, right, to get a little bit of an advantage. But you see, that is classic behavior by these captains. They, understood that within the rules of sports, they would do anything that they could in order to get an advantage if they thought they could get away with it. And I don't want to say this is great behavior. This is something that all people should emulate. But I think when you're looking at a job candidate and you see that there have been times where they've done something that was maybe not so wonderful in a broad sense, look at their motivation for doing it. When they introduced conflict or when they pushed back inside a team, were they doing it for personal reasons or were they doing it because they wanted the team to get better? The same thing goes for pushing the rules. Were they doing it to win, or were they doing it in sort of an aggressive way out of anger or frustration or something? So, think before you disqualify someone for their behavior, because if it was motivated by making the team better collectively, then, it's not the sort of original sin that you might think it is. And the final one I want to throw out is that, these kinds of people, a lot of people have asked me, well, what do you do when you have someone like this and they're valuable, but they are humble and they don't really want accolades or awards or, any sort of recognition from the team? The thing that I would recommend is they care deeply and they want to know that they're appreciated. So my prescription would be, look, don't say a word. Just write down a number on a piece of paper and walk over their desk and slip it across the desk and say, we gave you a 20% raise. We understand your value and we know what you do. And we also know that you wouldn't want us to make a big deal out of it. So, here it is. Congratulations. You hope if there's anything we can do for you, let us know. And that's the way to handle these kinds of people. Don't give them a Employee of the Month plaque at a big ceremony, and don't make a big splash. You just need to make them feel that they're being appreciated and treated fairly. They don't need to make the most money. They don't need to get the most recognition. They don't care about the credit, but they do care that they're appreciated and that their role is understood.
And if you're looking and you're a business person, you're listening to this, obviously, we need to make sure that the people that work for us are doing things on the up and up, right? That are honest and have integrity and aren't doing anything that's going to put the organization or its employees in prison, right? So, and or doing things that are not upstanding and legal. How do you sort of marry that? If this person has all those great traits and they push the envelope, how do you navigate that?
No, and thanks for bringing that up, because this is a really hard point to explain to people. I'm not advocating breaking the rules. I think what I learned, a lot of cases when these captains broke the rules, it backfired, and they wound up regretting it. A lot of times they were very good at reading the referees. Richie McCaw, who was the captain of the New Zealand All Blacks, one of the great rugby teams of all time, he had a ritual where he would talk to the referees before the match, and he would try to get a sense of how they were playing to call the game, and he would play right up to that line. And sometimes he went over and did things that were he got sent to the penalty box for. But most of the times, I think there was that intelligence, that understanding that you have to kind of push the boundaries of what's acceptable all the way to the edge. Now, the example I would give, and this is not a perfect example, but it is a prominent example. And a lot of people talk about Steve Jobs and his management style. And so much is made of the way he would reduce people to tears, and he would ask the team leader about a product he wasn't happy with, and then fire them on the spot. Or he would, he was famous for that. And a lot of people have portrayed him as a bully and a jerk, and said, this is not the kind of behavior that we want to emulate. Now, I'm not making any value judgments on this, but what I will say about Jobs is that, again, look at the way they are. And it's one thing to behave that way inside a business context. Clearly, he pushed the rules of polite society and polite business practice to the maximum. But outside of the office, that wasn't his personality. He wasn't doing thuggish things and getting in trouble. I think he understood that, there was a different realms, and every realm has its own sort of set of rules. And sometimes you need to get the most that you can out of everything. And so, yeah, no, and anything illegal, that's obviously in a different category. But I think if someone does things that are unpleasant or caustic or feels like they're causing trouble or they're creating conflict or they're pushing back or they're dissenting against some initiative that you care about, you really have to look at their motivation. If the motivation is they want the team to succeed and they don't think this is the right way to go, then, or they're doing something because they want to push the team to its maximum capacity, then it's different. It's different than having a personal problem with someone or having just an irritable personality or not getting your way and losing your temper. I mean, those things are destructive. They're personal conflict. That's toxic. It's the kind of conflict that is good is task conflict, which is something that behavioral psychologists have identified as being crucially important inside teams that perform under pressure with real results on the line. And I think in a lot of cases, if you can see that not all conflict is the same because its motivations are different, then I think you'll start to get an appreciation for these people.
That's an interesting delineation. That is really cool. You sort of identify these 7 traits. Did every captain have all 7, or could somebody have 5 of the 7 or 6 of the 7, or they have to have all 7?
Yeah, no, all 7. I found examples of all 7 in each captain. Now, depending on their what sport they played or what their careers were like, there were some who didn't really use a couple of them, right? I mean, maybe mildly, but they never really had to use them. They were clearly there, but they didn't actually put them into practice. The best analogy that I've used is that it was almost like if you want to create a team that will endure, and look, you can have a successful team without this kind of person, but if you want that success to endure, if you want to keep repeating it over and over again, it's that person that's going to do it. Because the difference is that a lot of times when in an organization or on a sports team, when things are going great, leadership isn't really that important. I mean, everyone's doing their job. Everything's going well. You don't see leadership. Where you see it is in those moments where everything starts to go south and where, everything starts to fray. That's when you have this phenomenon where the superstars on the team start looking, dusting off their resumes, and the managers start, worrying about how things are going to be perceived and doing, take kind of overcompensating or over functioning. It's the people. That's when you have these captains. And these captains were classic middle managers. They were people who stood between management and the rest of the team, and they had some autonomy and independence. And that's when they act. That's when you see the leadership. You see these people hold the team together, and the way they hold them together is with one of these 7 traits. Depending on the situation and depending on what's necessary and what the team needs at that moment, they need all of them. It's like there's 7 tools on a pegboard, right?
Right.
And like they see things going bad, and they will pull off the one that they need to use in that situation, and they will employ it, and they will help hold the team together and pull it through, and then they'll put it back, and they'll go back to whatever they were doing before. But it's a series of ways, and in the book I try to demonstrate actually how these traits actually made the team better, and all the ways that they actually improve the actual performance of the team. And you have to have all of them, and you have to be able to use them and know when to use them, and that's part of the genius of being a great leader.
Wow, you talked about Tim Duncan and how he embodies so many of these. Can you get me kind of inside of his world a little bit more and how that's come to life? Maybe some examples. Obviously, you've used some in the book. You talk about him a lot, right, in the book. Tell me more about him.
He's such a terrific example. He's just extraordinary. And it's a shame he's retired now because, I don't think people totally appreciated what he did. The Spurs, his entire career, 19 seasons, they made the playoffs every year. And they had the highest long-term winning percentage in NBA history by far. I mean, I don't think anyone will ever touch that mark that they set. So Duncan was fascinating because everyone said he was the most boring superstar in the history of sports. And, that's the thing about Duncan that made him a little different, is that he did have superstar talent. I mean, he could have easily scored 30 points a game and led the NBA in scoring. But what he did, if you watch his career, there were seasons where they needed more offense, so he scored more. If there were seasons where they needed better defense, he got more blocks and, sacrificed scoring. There were seasons where he had teammates who were great scorers, and their totals went up and his went down. There were seasons that he had to carry a lot more of the load. You would see his statistics change depending on the circumstances. That's the idea of carrying water. And Duncan would do whatever needed to be done. And, late in his career, I think the greatest example is, he took a pay cut to stay with the Spurs so they could sign better players. And here's someone who could have been making 4 times what he was making. And instead, he took a reduced salary so that the team could be better. And that's
pretty unique in sports. Yeah, as a former sports agent, I can tell you that doesn't happen very much.
No, it doesn't. Well, Kevin Durant, okay. I will say, though, the Golden State Warriors, are the best example of this model right now.
For sure.
The guy there is Andre Iguodala. And Andre Iguodala is not Kevin Durant. He's not Steph Curry. He's not the star of the team, but he is the captain and the glue that holds them together. And that team is fascinating because not only did Iguodala see this coming and sign with his team even when no one thought he should. He was an NBA All-Star. He was enthusiastic about signing Durant, which meant he was going to be on the bench. I mean, he's coming off the bench. He's an NBA All-Star who could start anywhere else. And then this season, Durant took a pay cut to stay with the Warriors. It's just they've got that thing.
Yeah, they do.
And it all revolves around Iguodala, who was really the person who saw the potential and was there from the beginning.
Hey, going back to the Spurs for a minute, a lot of their success could be credited toward Gregg Popovich too, right?
No, and that's a good point. See, that's the thing about Popovich. I mean, coaches, everyone thinks that a coach like Popovich, terrific coach, and he's someone who's, we think of coaches as being really the ultimate controlling authorities on their team, but the relationship between Duncan and Popovich is the same relationship I saw over and over again with these captains and their coaches. It's not a boss-employee relationship, it's a partnership. Those two are, they love each other but they also bicker like an old married couple. I mean, it's really funny. I mean, there have been times where they get in a little fight, and Duncan's so mad at Popovich that he would sit at the scorer's table because they didn't want to be anywhere near him. I mean, they fight and battle with each other, but at the end of the day, Popovich understands that, once the game begins, his role and his ability to influence the outcome is very limited. And he understands that it's really up to Duncan to direct traffic and to make sure that the team is executing the plan. And all these great coaches said the same thing, which is that, when the match starts, the game starts, the responsibility of executing the game plan is the captains. And they have to sit back and they have to be willing to understand that there are things that a field general can do that they can't. And it's a perfect example because Popovich and Duncan together are unstoppable. Duncan without Popovich, Popovich without Duncan, I really doubt it.
Wow, that's very interesting. Very, very interesting. That's cool to hear you say it because you've obviously studied this at length. That's interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think that relationship that you have in business with that person who is kind of your point person in a division or in some part of your organization, that's such an important relationship. And I don't think we spend enough time thinking about it and cultivating it and making sure that we have the right kind of person, because you have to be able to give them a long leash and let them do their thing. And that's hard for a lot of executives to see because they think, they ultimately think they're responsible and want to be responsible, and they don't give these people enough freedom.
Well, it's so interesting. I represented a lot of coaches, and they always was a space that they struggled with, right? Was finding the right leader, and they did. They often would look to the leading scorer, and that was where they would start. And it's interesting to hear you talk about it in this way. If you're a coach or a leader, what advice would you give them on how to sort of quickly, you're going into a season, or you're, launching a new division, or you're whatever it might be inside of an organization, and you need to identify the right person to be your captain. What's the quick formula for somebody in that role to try to do that? Whether you're a coach of a team or whether you're a leader of an organization.
I think the interesting thing about the 7 traits that I outline in this book, which was, I think, a great message for everyone, is that the 2 things that you will not find in those traits are talent and charisma. I mean, there's no God-given ability that makes someone a good leader. These 7 traits were all about behavior. It's about the choices that you make every day in a team context. It's about decisions. And, behavior can be emulated and copied. So you can develop people and you can push them. You can see that they have the right characteristics and mindset, but you can still push them toward these principles and toward behaving in a way that's positive for the team. So, the first thing is, look, you have to name the captain yourself. And I see a lot of teams, I've talked to a lot of teams who have the players elect the captains. And it does work. I've seen it work in some cases, but only if you already have a very strong team culture. If you don't have that, you have to do it yourself, and you have to give it a lot of thought. And, what I would say is that there are many more people than you think who have these qualities. And that's, who have the potential to be an elite leader. And they all have to develop, though. All these captains had some time before they became captain to develop these characteristics. So, if you look around the room and you don't see anyone who fits this mold automatically, that's okay. You can skate by for a while. But the important thing is that you identify someone in the organization, or you hire someone who you think has these characteristics. And then it becomes a matter of bringing them along and helping them understand the nature of effective leadership, and also being able to make it clear that they're a peer, that they're someone who you want to work with and you want to give independence to. And, it's very tricky to bring that kind of person along, but that's where it starts. And if you can figure out who that person is and help them, you modify their behavior and learn the right choices to make in these situations, then it's only a matter of time before that person takes over. And listen, once you have one of these people in place, and once you make sure that the team around them is supporting them, and that the person has everything they need to create that kind of culture, then it starts to sustain itself. I've seen a lot of teams, and even in business, where there's just a certain DNA, there's a culture, and it just automatically tends to put the right person in charge, and it can repeat itself for a long time. So really, you got to start somewhere, and if you don't have someone like this, it's okay, but you got to start developing one.
That is cool. We're seeing sometimes organizations that are experimenting with sort of this flat structure.
Yes.
What do you think about that? Is that a mistake?
I think it's not a mistake. It's not a mistake. I mean, it's a symptom, and I think the symptom is that it's a symptom of a culture that has kind of come out of Silicon Valley, where everyone is looking to these new emerging companies and pulling management secrets from them. And I think we're trying to hire millennials and younger workers. They tend to respond to some of the themes that are coming out of these businesses. The problem is what we're doing essentially is we're taking these companies that have just been on nothing but an upward growth curve for years, with incredibly explosive results and growth and interest and investment. And, some of them aren't even making money yet, but that's okay because they're the future, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So the problem is what happens when things go bad. That's, as I said before, that's when you need leadership. And if you don't have that solid middle layer, you can't just have the founders of the company and the superstar talent communicating directly. You can do that if things are going well, but when things go badly, that fractures quickly, and there's no one in the middle to hold the team together, because the ideal person is someone who does not care about their own advancement. They care about the collective goals and success of the group. And when things go badly, those are the only people in the organization who are going to hold it together and who are going to understand both sides, what management's doing, what the rest of the workforce is doing, and be able to say, this is the initiative that will work. But we're going to make these adjustments as we execute it. And then they're going to pull out one of these leadership traits, and they're going to really lean on it in that moment to hold the organization together. And that's the problem with flat hierarchies. If you happen to have a company that's going to have 20% growth every year, fine, go flat. That's great. But I fear for you a little bit when the curve flattens out.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think I've seen this inside of organization. I've seen it inside of sports teams, right? So, but the way that you've pulled these 7 together in a nice, clean little methodology, right, is incredibly helpful for so many of us. You talk in the book a lot about how conflict can be healthy in a team environment, that it's personal conflict that can be the toxin. What role do you see conflict play inside of these elite teams?
I was surprised by these teams on many cases, because there's a sense that we all have. I don't know where it comes from, that a lot of great teams are homogenous, and it's true. There have been a lot of great teams, especially national teams, where a lot of the players came from similar backgrounds, but what I found with these teams is there were some that were just incredibly complex. And my favorite example is Brazil. Brazil, greatest soccer team from 58 to 62 that ever existed, and they won 2 World Cups back to back. And the fascinating thing about Brazil was that everyone thinks, okay, Brazil's this place that just produces these incredible talents, like Pelé, right? I mean, the best soccer player probably of all time. And, we think of it as a talent factory, but the reality of Brazil, and I went down and talked to some of their former captains about this, is that it's an incredibly complex country, and there's so many different nationalities and backgrounds. There are kids who come from places where they never had shoes and can't read, and then there are people who come from very wealthy backgrounds, and they're all mashed together in this national soccer team. And holding that team together is incredibly difficult because there's just no way to do it easily. So it was so difficult not to hold the team together. It was also so difficult to be a superstar in Brazil because you're worshipped like a god. So they understood this. Everybody just implicitly understood this. So if you look at those Brazilian teams, Pelé was never the captain. And I asked him about this, why he was never the captain. And he said it was never even an issue, never anything I wanted to do. It was just not. There was no obvious logic in him being the captain. So the captains of those teams were these central defenders you've never heard of. Hilderaldo Bellini, was a guy who never scored a goal for Brazil in his whole career. He was a tackling dummy, basically, for the other team's best players. But he was this guy whose job was to hold the team together, and he was incredibly good at dealing with all the different kinds of personalities on the team and dealing with management, dealing with the coach, and helping the team through its toughest moments. And, he never got any credit for it, and he was certainly not the star of that team, but he didn't care, and that's ultimately the thing. When you talk about diverse organizations and organizations that are tough to hold together, that's the only kind of person that can do it. That's the only leadership model, I think, that's able to handle it.
And so it's got to be somebody that can step into conflict and deal with it and navigate it.
Yes. No, the conflict point. Yeah. No, the conflict thing is really important. And the thing is, there's something that researchers call the pain of independence, and it's a really interesting concept. It's like they've actually shown that it's physically painful to stand apart from the group and to take a dissenting opinion, and it's really an act of courage and takes a lot of fortitude. And these captains were willing to be lonely. They were willing to be to stand apart from their teammates, from management. They were willing to take whatever would come if they felt something that was happening that wasn't helping. And they were very outspoken and would push back immediately. And that kind of courage is something that we often think of as being a toxin, especially in sports. I mean, there's a great tendency to just get rid of someone who is agitating in the clubhouse, and they get shipped off, right? But that is, you have to look more closely because there are two kinds of conflict. As I said, there's personal conflict. That's when you just don't like somebody, you just don't get along with someone, and your motivation for creating conflict is that you don't want someone to succeed, or you want to injure them in some way. And you see that a lot, and that kind of conflict is toxic. But all the research shows that, on teams that perform under pressure intensely together, you need this other form of conflict, which is task conflict. And when you saw these captains, every time that they did it, my favorite example is this Russian hockey team, and this guy, Valery Vasilyev, who was at the time, in 1980, when they lost to the Americans in the famous Miracle on Ice, he was just a defenseman on the team, a veteran player. On the plane ride home, there's this famous incident where, actually not famous, it's kind of very little known, but when they were flying home, the coach of the team, who had told the players, look, we all lost together, we're going to go to Moscow and we'll take blame equally, had started with his assistant coaches in the first class cabin. He started trashing all the individual players. This guy was terrible. This guy, get rid of this guy. And Vasilyev overheard this and he came into the first class cabin and started choking the coach.
Oh my.
and threatened to throw him off the airplane if he didn't take it back, right?
Dang.
I mean, this is the Soviet
That's
Union.
intense.
And it's crazy. This is like a one-way ticket to Siberia,
right?
Right. So any other team, I mean, you've seen choking assaults on coaches before in American sports, and it's just an immediate dismissal, and that player's never really going to have trouble getting a job. But in this case, what I didn't understand was what happened next, which is right after that huge loss to the U.S., huge embarrassment, they suddenly became the best hockey team that's ever lived. I mean, they just beat the crap out of everyone, pardon my French. They even beat this team of NHL All-Stars with Gretzky and Bobby Orr and all these legends 8-1.
Wow.
8-1.
Right,
I mean,
right, right.
Killed them. And then the other thing that was weird was that a few months after that the choking incident, the players named Vasiliev as their captain, and the coach, everyone let the decision stand. And, it took me a long time and a lot of interviews with former players on that team to figure out what was going on. And what happened was this looked like every bit like personal conflict, right? Like Vasiliev just hated his coach and wanted to choke him. But what happened was the next day he came to practice and was like, "Hey, coach," and he got on the ice and he did his thing. And it wasn't personal. He was trying to hold that team together in one of those tough moments. He wanted to unify them, and that's why he did that. That act of outrageous dissent was a way to hold the team together. There was a point to it. The motivation was to win. It wasn't because he hated his coach. He made very clear that it wasn't personal. And everyone, even in the Soviet Union, understood that immediately. And he became the leader of that team. And look what happened. I mean, they became better after suffering that terrible humiliation. So that's what I'm talking about. Even something that looks like personal conflict, if you really unpack it, it's not. And it's something else. And, we might throw somebody out wrongly for misunderstanding the difference.
Yeah, you've got to really dig into it and look at it and understand it, is what I'm hearing you say, which is cool.
Yeah, no, you got to think about it. A lot of it is just thinking about people's motivations for why they do things.
Sure.
And not the act itself and the circumstances, but the motivation. And that's where conflict can hurt us, because we don't diagnose the reasons for it right. But that's where we can also find these gems.
Yeah. What would you say is the biggest misconception people have about leadership after all this work and research you've done, which is incredibly extensive?
I think it's this idea that it shouldn't be hard to spot them. I think that's really the main thing. It's that there's some prejudice we all have where we think that a leader should be someone who has exceptional skills or something exceptional about them. And that's what we make the basis, our decisions, we make them on that basis. We think, okay, this person is clearly exceptional. So in order to be an exceptional leader, you have to be an exceptional person. And it's a very logical thing to think. And it's something that I think, movies and television and a lot of sort of renderings of historical leaders will lead us to believe. But really, that was the most shocking thing. All the research I looked at and all the great academics who studied teams and studied team psychology all, have ultimately moved closer to the same conclusion, which is that those things don't matter. And a lot of great leaders are really dull and not flashy and not interesting and not exceptional on the surface in any way. It's just how you behave. It's every choice you make every day, added up. And that is what leadership is. It's really about just taking a functional approach. Is everything getting done that needs to get done from a management perspective? That's the only question that a leader needs to ask. It's not about grand gestures. It's not about showing how talented you are, how exceptional you are. It's really just about making the right decision in every moment over and over and over again, and always thinking about the collective and never thinking about yourself.
Do you think sometimes it's the leadership thinks, well, I got to get the person that's producing the greatest results because that's who people respect? How do you, if you've got somebody that's got these 7 traits, right, but they're not necessarily, like you said, the defenseman that wasn't scoring any goals, so they're not producing, how do you get the other people that need to follow that person to see what an impactful leader this person is or can be?
My experience, I don't think there's any way to do it. I think if you found the right person, though, that person will prove it. That person will earn that respect. And there's so many examples of these captains and how they did that. And, one of my favorite ones is Carla Overbeck, who was the captain of the U.S. women's national soccer team that won the World Cup in 1999. And that's a very famous team, but, you don't remember Carla Overbeck.
No,
I didn't even
not
know
at all.
who she was.
No question.
You remember Mia Hamm
Totally.
and Julie Foudy and all those people.
For
and
sure.
Brandy Chastain. I mean, those are the names that stick in our heads. Well, Carla Overbeck, there's a reason for that, because Carla Overbeck did not care. She did not want to be on stage. When the whole team went to Midtown Manhattan for this big pep rally after the World Cup, she flew home. She wanted nothing. She didn't want to be on Letterman. She wanted to go home, and she was doing laundry while her teammates were taking this trip in the spotlight. It wasn't out of malice. She's like, my job was to win this trophy, and that's all she cared about. But her teammates just thrived behind her leadership because they were allowed to be superstars, and they were superstars. And, she took no credit, and all she did was serve the team. My favorite example of that is that the team would go on these long road trips, and they would have a long flight, and they would get to their hotel, they'd be exhausted, and they'd get a knock on the door, and it would be Carla Overbeck, and she was carrying their luggage from the bus to their rooms for them.
Wow.
And she was the captain of the team.
Wow.
But that was her whole mentality. And she knew that by those little acts of service and selflessness, what happened was one of her coaches said she was doing this on purpose because she understood they gave her this currency, and it gave her this, her teammates understood that she was genuinely interested in the collective and not in herself. And so on the field, this is how she used it. She was able to really rip into her teammates when they weren't focused or when they were making mistakes.
Sure.
But they understood that it was coming from a genuine place. They understood that it wasn't personal. So she earned it, and everyone on that team understood at some point who she was and what she was all about. And if you found the right person, it may take some time, but some moment will come when they are going to demonstrate that in very clear terms to everybody that they will do whatever it takes to help the team, no matter, without thinking of themselves. And that is a really powerful drug. And when other players see that, especially star players,
for sure,
it's often a huge relief because they're like, I get to just do my thing. It's hard being a superstar
and being the captain. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, it's hard to be a star, so I can go be a star and work on my game. And this person's going to be behind me, cleaning up the messes and taking care of all the mundane tasks of management. And I think that ultimately, I've never seen one of these captains who wasn't able to win over their teammates to the point where they really understood what they were about. So I think if you pick the right person, you just got to let them do their thing, and they will ultimately win the room.
Oh my gosh. Sam, you've been so generous with your time. I tell you what, this is awesome stuff. I mean, I loved your book, The Captain Class, and obviously it's people can get it wherever books are sold, but it's an awesome, awesome book and powerful, powerful lessons. And thanks for the time that you spent to put that book together. I know that wasn't an easy process.
Yeah, no, it was
oh my God.
But thank you for all that. No, it's great. And thanks for the great questions.
I want to just end. We end every podcast with a rapid fire section where we just sort of, I'm going to fire out some questions for you, and just tell me what comes to mind. Okay, so the last book that you read.
I'm reading now. I'm not quite done, but I'm reading Walter Isaacson's book about Leonardo da Vinci.
Nice. I heard that's a good one.
It's pretty good.
Best athlete interview you've conducted.
Well, for this book, it was Carlos Puyol, who I spent a couple of days with, the Barcelona captain, who was one of my favorite people ever. But I think my favorite interview of all time was I talking to Drew Bledsoe after the Super Bowl loss in 97, it must have been 98. It was just, it was just me and him after the game, and it was just this kind of raw, kind of fascinating trip through his mind, after losing the biggest game of his life. And I'll never forget it. The sort of honesty and the sort of, it just gave me a great understanding of what these athletes go through.
Mm-hmm. It was raw in that moment. He was pretty raw, right?
Yeah. It was really raw, and in a way, I wouldn't have expected. I mean, it was. What was going through his mind was really fascinating, and I learned a lot about just how hard it is to prepare and how much work goes into a season and how quickly it can get away from you. And it was just fascinating. And I was a young reporter at the time, and it was just kind of a real wake up.
What's your favorite sports moment of all time?
I think, well, I didn't witness it, but I still can't get over Secretariat at the Belmont. I mean, every time I watch it, it just gives me chills. I just can't believe that horse existed and that it was 20 lengths better than everybody else. It's great. I think that was really, if I could go back to something, that would be high on my list.
Yeah, that's neat. My husband's a big horse racing guy, so he's all over that. What's one thing on your bucket list?
Bucket list. I think at some point I'm a car nut, so I restore classic cars badly. But it's not that crazy, but I really want to take, at some point, I want to get some phenomenal, like, vintage sports car, and I want to spend a week in northern Italy, like in the Lake District, just driving those roads.
Wow. You're pretty vivid on that.
Yeah, no, it's going to happen.
Good stuff. What's the best advice you've ever received?
The best advice I ever received, it was about writing, because that's what I do, and it was just such a load off when I heard this the first time. It was an old editor of mine, and he said, there's no such thing as writing. It's all rewriting. You don't write. It doesn't just come out of you. Writing is about the going over it and changing it and fixing it and unfixing it, and it's that whole process, that awful process of making something perfect. And that was great, and I just love that, because everyone thinks they're going to sit down and write, and they write something and they're really unhappy with it, and I think that's a problem. It's because you haven't rewritten it. You got to rewrite it. You got to rewrite it 10, 15, 20 times before it actually works. So that's something I'll never forget, and it really kind of made me better at what I do. It
sounds a little bit like life, right? You wake up every day and you get a little bit better the next day, hopefully, a little bit better, and you just keep reliving every day.
Yes. No, cool. It's true. I think it applies to a lot of things.
The show's called Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, and so my last question to you is this, which is, who's a game changer in your life that's inspired you or inspires you, and why?
So this is an easy one for me, because, I did this. The first thing you do, I think, when you write a book like this, and I came up with these traits, and once I came up with the traits, I said, all right, I'm going to do a self-assessment here. This one, nah, not really that. No, not that. Maybe that. And I probably got like a C- on the captain traits, and I started to think, well, who in my life really has all of these qualities? And I thought of a few people I've worked with who definitely have all of them. But then I thought, you know what? That's my wife right there.
Wow.
And it was
pretty
really
cool.
kind of amazing. She's just got all of these traits. And, the fact that I was able to get this book done, and, we have a couple kids, and I have a full-time job. She runs a company. She's, the fact that this was able to happen at all is really a testament to her and and to all those traits and all those abilities that she brings to our family, which I thought was, it gave me just an even greater appreciation for her, because, I think those kinds of people are rare. And if you happen to have one living with you, you're in good hands.
Wow, that's really cool. It's really cool that it's your wife. And it's kind of cool that her last name's Fletcher, by the way.
Yeah, well,
you and I talked about that. And, Sam, we both grew up in Michigan, and you went to the wrong school. I went to the right one, but I still love you, and I appreciate you.
All right. Well, you won, so.
Well, yeah, buckle up, man. We're still going. But listen, Sam, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, you and the work that you've done is really powerful, and I know it's helping so many captains and teams and leaders and organizations all over the world. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Molly. I really appreciate that.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.